Okay, so in the lecture today, we are going to be talking about the antebellum South and the myth of the Old South, and then making that step up to the Kansas-Nebraska Act. And if we rehash from the last time, go over the last time, we were talking about the Compromise of 1850. And that's really beginning what historians will start calling the crisis of the Union, that decade leading up to the Civil War. And it's important to note, and too often we hear this historically, is that people will say that, well, it was inevitable. History's never inevitable. It's made by a series of decisions that you go further and further and further, but it's not inevitable. It's a matter of choices. When we say something is inevitable, then we're just sort of throwing our hands up and taking no responsibility for our actions, right? So when we're getting to this crisis of the Union, it's not inevitable. People make choices, and they either try to hold on to what they have and not change their mind or not compromise, or they abandon a plan and go a different way. You can't see me. Can Lori see me real quickly? Lori can see me fine. Anthony, you might be the lucky one that you can't see me. I'm not sure what's going on your end, but you might want to check. Oh, Anthony's going to try to log back in. Okay, so let's get back on to the Old South. And when we talk about the Old South, it's often, there's a lot of myths about the Old South. Probably the first myth that we see is the plantation myth. And if you want to see a good example of the plantation myth, just go watch Gone with the Wind. Gone with the Wind is 100% what we call lost cause mythology, where everybody was happy, right? Or in antebellum periods, there was some literature of the super evil plantation where everything was completely horrible. These myths obviously die hard. What's really going to set the South apart, really, one is climate, right? It's warm, it's humid, and we've said this before, this fostered the growth of staple crops, thus leading to plantations and slaves. And this is also interesting as well, is that there was little class conflict in the United States. And that's because Southerners wanted to keep that class conflict to a minimum. That way they could use racism to see these class inequities disappear, because you might be a poor white, but at least you were not a slave, right? In fact, if we were to look at a Marxist interpretation of this, they would argue that racism is an artificial creation to hide class conflict. That would probably be more of a Marxist interpretation of that. Well, so when you have no class conflict, even the poor whites, they would hope, and we're talking about the slayer, that they would actually rise up and they would never be slaves. And then also in the South, there are very few immigrants. Very few immigrants really come to the South after the Revolution because they didn't want to compete with slave labor. Another thing that sets the South apart is alienation. They really felt alienated from the country. And think about that for a moment in this regards, when we talk about the Missouri Compromise, where you actually drew a line across the United States between North and South, right? I mean, that's pretty much as alienation as you can get when you're drawing a line saying, here's the North, here's the South, here's where slaves can exist, and here's where they cannot be brought. And then there was a work ethic. Southerners liked fighting. They liked the military. They liked this country gentleman ideal, right? Where you don't have to work. You didn't dirty your hands. And you certainly, whatever you did not get into manufacturing, right? Manufacturing was considered a dirty work. They had very few centers of manufacturing and didn't have respect for people that did that kind of work. In fact, for Northerners, they saw them as just what they call stock jobbers, money grubbers. And the South had a lot of agricultural diversity. We often think of the South as being just cotton, right? But the Upper South, and we're talking about places like Tennessee and Kentucky, they farmed much like the old Northwest. They grew a lot of corn everywhere. The problem was that a lot of that corn didn't go to market because the transportation infrastructure, whether that was rail or canals, had been so centered in the north. And you can see that if you look at old maps on that. And of course, on many farms, the growing season decides what's planted. And then, of course, livestock would add to the diversity of the farm economy. The South, which had far fewer people than the North, had half the nation's cattle, 60% of its pigs and hogs, almost half the nation's horses, half the nation's oxen, and 90% of its mules, probably most serving in state legislatures or in local government. And of course, Southern staple crops tended to exhaust the soil very quickly, and so fields have to be abandoned and rotated around. Now, we're going to go back to manufacturing and trade here for a moment. The South, of course, is very dependent on agriculture. They're even dependent on food from northern states to feed themselves because they're growing so many of these staple crops. Now, when you look at manufacturing in the South, and this is going to be an impact, obviously, when we get to the Civil War, there was this belief that slaves were unsuited for factory work. And of course, Southern gentlemen had a disdain for commercial activity. And this lack of manufacturing base is, of course, going to prove to be very costly in the Civil War. I think it's important to note that really manufacturing in the South doesn't take off in a large way until the advent of air conditioning, where you could actually have a cooler place to work in some of these southern states. And even today, when you look at GDP of the South compared to the North, it still lags behind, but it's catching up. It shows you the impact of this time period. So let's look at the different parts of society in the South. And we'll start off with white society in the South. Now, the ruling class in the South was, of course, yes, that's true, inherited from British aristocrats. Sorry, I get a note, and I always want to make sure I contact it. So the ruling class in the South were known as planters. Now, that makes you start to think about planters' peanuts, right? Or even when you think of Colonel Sanders, he's modeled after a planter, interestingly enough. Well, the planters were, well, let me describe them this way. Planters were those people that grew crops for profits, whereas small slave owners didn't do that. They were primarily just doing subsistence farming. Planters didn't work in the field along their slaves. Small slave owners did. You might own 2 or 3 slaves, but you're out in the field working as well. To be called a planter, if you wanted to get into what they call the planter class, you had to have at least 20 or more slaves. Now, according to the 1860 census, in the South, there were about 46,000 planters. Fewer than 8,000 had 50 or more slaves. 2,300 had about 100 slaves. One had 500 slaves, and one had 1,000 slaves. And as somebody pointed out in the chat just a few minutes ago, planters thought of themselves much like the English gentry, right? We had talked about the Tidewater gentry earlier. Now, of course, if there's only 46,000 planters, that means most Southern whites were small farmers. But these small farmers who had very little don't challenge the planter class because, simply put, they wanted to be a planter someday. And there was always that hope that you could become a planter someday. And so that's where we're talking about that class conflict being muted in the South. Now, next up is going to be the middle class. That's the small farmer, the skilled workers. Some were sons of planters. Most wanted to be planters. And this is probably the largest group in the South, white yeoman farmers who tended to live in crude 2-room houses. When we talk about privacy today, I try to explain to my students, imagine living in a 2-room house, and it's a husband and a wife, maybe a grandparent, and 8 kids in a 2-room house. They raised a few hogs, a few chickens, they grew some corn, some cotton. They traded with neighbors more than anything else, not stores. And they lived in the Shenandoah Valley, which we all know it's a beautiful area, down to northern Alabama. These areas had real rich soil access, but no access to markets. We're not going to see that access to markets actually until we get to the FDR administration and the TVA project, which makes a lot of the rivers eventually navigable and opens up those markets. These people tended to be fairly independent people. They also identified with the party of Andrew Jackson. That was their hero. Now, at the bottom of the white class of society were the poor whites. These were the degraded classes, off in the hills and hollers. Actually hollows, but hollers is what we often call them. My dad grew up in a place called Butcher's Holler, which is an area between a couple of mountains. Most of their livestock roams the woods. They don't have anything fenced off. They tended to be very lank. I often think of the movie Deliverance, people living out in that area. Or if you were to go today and find some of the poor areas of the Appalachian region and see those societies, it would remind you of this time period. They were very lank. They liked hunting. They liked fishing. They liked moonshine. But they suffered from a series of dietary problems, which helped give rise to infections. And they also suffered from what they call lazy diseases, hookworm, malaria, pellagra. And a lot of these diseases lead to lethargy, obviously. Many poor whites had dietary deficiencies that led to the eating of clay. In fact, a lot of northern Alabama people were known as the dirt eaters. And I know there's somebody out there that can tell me the disease that sometimes even pregnant women will get this pica. Thank you. I knew I had somebody out there who would tell me they get pica and have a craving for clay or dirt. So they were called the dirt eaters. I'm pretty sure they haven't named a football team after them yet. But as poor as they were, they knew they weren't slaves. So let's look at Black society in the South. And first off, we'll talk about free persons of color. These are free Blacks, often occupying a very uncertain status. They're balanced between slavery and freedom. They were subject to legal restrictions that were not imposed on whites. So how did they get their freedom? Well, some had been indentured servants and got their freedom. Some had been freed by war service. That was something that was eligible in some of the wars. Some were freed by slave owners in the wills, or for other reasons. Some might have been of mixed race. Most were skilled workers, farmers or common laborers. And in 1860, the last census before the Civil War, roughly about 262,000 free people of color were in the South, mainly the Upper South. Many deep South states didn't like the idea of free Blacks. They felt that that would lead to revolution. Let's talk about the trade and slavery. Now, from 1790, first census, 1860, census before the Civil War, the amount of enslaved people in the United States went from about 700,000 to 4 million. This was mainly attributed to an increase in birth rates, like with the rest of the nation, and better supplies to food. But if you remember, and we talked about this in a unit almost 3 weeks ago, maybe 4 weeks ago, part of the Constitution agreement with the Three-Fifths Compromise was that they would outlaw the slave trade in 1808. Well, between 1808 and 1860, historians estimate that probably 600,000 slaves were brought in illegally to the country by people, sorry Texans, like Jim Bowie. He was an illegal slave trader, which if you go on Amazon Prime and try to watch the Jim Bowie 1950s TV show, you just sort of have to shake your head at it. But whatever. But shutting off the slave trade in 1808, what that does is just increase the value of slaves. So in 1850, an enslaved person could cost you $1,500 to $2,000, a lot of money back then. And then slaves with special skills, a carpenter, a blacksmith, also would raise the value of an enslaved person. And what this does is it does tend to temper some of the harsher features of slavery. So that if you had something risky to do, dangerous work, then you wouldn't put slaves in that position. You would go find Irish immigrants, those that are around for dangerous work, rather than risking a valuable slave. So if you were digging in, let's say, I don't know, a trench, and you were afraid the trench could collapse, well, you didn't want to lose slaves there. So you just hired Irish immigrants, because if they died, then you hire more Irish immigrants. And so the end of the foreign slave trade gave rise to a domestic trade market. Every town had public auctioneers that were, and dealers who were willing to buy and sell slaveries. And of course, this broke up families. I mean, there's one thing you read about Jefferson, when Jefferson wanted to buy some more wine or he wanted some books, he would sell off some children. I know that some of you have been to Virginia, you've been to Colonial Williamsburg, which is a place where they reenact history. And for a long time, it was a very cleaned up version of history. And then they said, okay, look, we need to show that slave people were very much a part of this. And they would actually, and there was a PBS special on this if you're interested, they said, we're going to reenact a slave auction. And so they began, and of course they get actors, right? Reenactors come in and they stay in character. If you've been to Colonial Williamsburg, if you go up and try to talk to somebody about TV, they act like they don't know anything about TV. So they have these reenactors there, and they were doing the slave auction. Well, the audience, for some reason, I don't know if they didn't understand it or what was going on, it became very angry people in the crowd. It became very contentious. And eventually the actors, both the African-American actors and the white actors, had to say, look, we're reenacting. This is exactly what happened at the time. So if you can find that PBS special, I think you would enjoy it. Now, more than half of all slaves in 1860 worked on a plantation. And of course, the preferred job was household servant or skilled workers. Even if you were a skilled worker, you might have some time off on a Sunday where you could go out and earn some extra money. And of course, being a household servant meant that you didn't have to work in the fields. During the New Deal, they were fortunate to go out and find, as part of the Works Project Administration, I believe it was, they hired historians to go out and interview former slaves that were still alive. They're very elderly. They wanted to get the story straight and what had happened. And one of the things that they kept hearing about from these enslaved people, they said the difference between a good master and a bad one was the good one didn't whip you as much, right? So whenever somebody says, well, he was nice to slave, it's just not true. I mean, flogging was very common at the time. And so in 1860, we're talking 4 million slaves. So what about slave revolts? Well, there are only 3 notable slave revolts, and 2 of these were discovered before they got underway. One of them we've already talked about, Denmark Vesey. But one of the big ones that does get underway is Nat Turner. Now he's an enslaved person. He's an overseer of other slaves, and he had this vision that he was on a divine mission. So he organizes a small group, and Turner and the small group kill his master's household. And then they repeat the process at other small farms. And in the end, they end up killing 55 whites. What happens is the Virginia militia comes in and starts killing many slaves who had nothing to do with it. And of course, there's going to be very few Nat Turners. Nat Turner hides out in the cave, is eventually found and hanged. There's a great story or an analysis of Nat Turner's revolt. If I could remember the book off the top of my head, but I can't. I'll try to put it in my notes on the YouTube recording of this, is that one, what Nat Turner originally planned was to go and seize the arsenal. You needed guns. You had to have guns to revolt. 2, the further Nat Turner and his group got from where people knew them, the less likely slaves were going to join his rebellion. And they've tracked all this in a circle because they didn't trust him, they didn't know him. But again, very few Nat Turners, because often they were found out because somebody would talk, right, and let them know. So how did slaves retaliate against repression? Well, often by just working slower, slow down, or sabotaging equipment. But it's a problem. It's a conflict, because if you're an enslaved person, you know that you would eat better on a prosperous plantation than a poor one. So you are driven by two forces. One is that you're being beaten, right? Women are being raped. And if you work slower, then your family suffers from it. And slave owners, by the way, knew that rewards were better than inflicting pain. And I think the best way to say this leads to a mutual dependency as well as mutual antagonism. But what's the impact of slavery on the United States, at least in our culture? Of course, enslaved people brought a traditional belief of a supreme being. They merged a lot of their traditional African beliefs with Christian beliefs, because the Christian belief believes in redemption, and that they can identify with the Israelites in Egypt and Moses. In fact, that's one of the things that Nat Turner believes, that he's Moses, or a version of Moses. Same way later on when we get to the 1920s and we start talking about Marcus Garvey, they refer to Marcus Garvey as sort of a black Moses to lead their people out of bondage. Some slave owners encourage religion, but only certain parts of it. They pick out parts of the Bible that they think helps instill servants obeying their masters. Others do not, and so it leaves African Americans or enslaved people to have secret meetings. Now, this becomes an actual debate, and scholars have looked at this, because when we get into the defense of slavery, what does the Bible say? Does it condone it? Does it not condone it? We'll talk about that in a minute. What about slave marriages? Slave marriages have no legal status, right? They couldn't, because they're not considered people, they're considered property. But owners see marriages as stabilizing, right? Because this means that it was harder to run away if you had a family. So sometimes the slave owner would conduct the marriage themselves. Sometimes a minister would conduct the ceremony, or sometimes there was something called the broomstick wedding, which we've seen in other places as well, where you just jump over the broomstick and you're married. Now, we've talked about this before, that there's a greater equity in the household. Men and women are treated more equally because of the workload. Everybody's doing the same work. Very aware of the extended family, cousins, aunts, and so forth. And of course, there was always that problem of a breakup. I mean, when we go back to that Works Project Administration, there's several documents you can read on that, where you were married to somebody and then they sold you off. And then after the war, you read these letters, and they're looking for their husband or their wives. And of course, at the time, they thought they'd never see them again, and they remarried and started another life. It's heart-wrenching. And then we get to this other problem that we're going to see here in the South, and that's rape. Slave owners rape slave women. This is not uncommon. I mean, if you think about Jefferson and Sally Hemings, the question you ask yourself, and these are tough questions, is, can an enslaved person give consent? My answer would be no, right? No matter how you try to move that around, it's no. But they would come down and take advantage of slave women, rape them. Owners will rationalize that slave women were, they said, naturally promiscuous, and that by using slave women, they were protecting the virginity of white women. And by 1860, there are probably about 400,000, this is probably a dramatic undercount, persons of mixed ancestry. That was at least 10% of the population. There's a really good diary about this known as Mary Chestnut's diary. Mary Chestnut was in, I believe, South Carolina. And in a section of it, she says, you can see all these redheaded slaves going by. And it's unspoken secret of the South that they knew that their husbands were doing these things, because all of a sudden you saw this mixed ancestry child pop up. And so they knew this was going on if you were a wife of a planter, but you didn't say anything. So let's talk about anti-slavery movements. A lot of them pop up. One of the earliest ones we're going to talk about is the American Colonization Society. And the idea was that they would take free slaves back to Africa. And this includes some famous people: James Madison, James Monroe, Henry Clay, John Marshall, Daniel Webster. They said, well, we'll just send you back to Africa in a place that we'll pick out for you. And the idea was, for some, they said this is a way to get rid of troublesome freed slaves, right? That those slaves that were freed who were speaking out against slavery, they'll just send them out of the country. And that would actually bolster slavery. And there were a lot of free blacks that were opposed to the plan, right? They were saying, look, no, we're Americans now. We've been here for 200 years. We're Americans now. We expect to be treated like Americans, not be sent away. But in 1821, the Colonization Society buys land in West Africa. By 1822, the first freed slaves arrive there. This becomes the country of Liberia. I'm sure a lot of you know that. But by 1860, only 15,000 freed slaves had moved there. And of course, their capital becomes Monrovia, the only other capital named after a US president, interestingly enough. So let's talk about gradualism and abolitionism. Gradualism was this idea that you would free slaves at some point, that when you got to 21, for example, you would become free. Abolitionism is that you abolish slavery immediately. And those sides, the abolitionists were considered the radicals, the gradualists were not. The problem is that you had some states, particularly like around Pennsylvania and that area, that had these gradualism laws that once you turned 21, you could become free. Well, if you imagine this as a slave owner, then you're a slave owner, you've got a slave who's 20 and will be free the next year. What do? How do you get that investment back? Well, you sell him down south, right? There's no gradualism law there. You can sell that slave and make money. Hence the phrase being sold down the river. They believe that's what that means. Well, in 1829, a free black in Boston by the name of David Walker publishes a pamphlet calling on slaves to revolt violently against their slave owners. Well, Southerners who just went through the Denmark-Vesey conspiracy and found that out, they want him arrested. They said, Massachusetts, you need to arrest that guy. Massachusetts says he's broken no laws. We're not going to arrest the guy. All right, so this is leading to some tension here between North and South. In 1831, William Lloyd Garrison publishes The Liberator. It's an anti-slavery newspaper. If you've ever been out to Boston Commons, it's on the southeast corner. There's a church there. William Lloyd Garrison preached there, and so did Frederick Douglass spoke there. But The Liberator is an anti-slavery newspaper. It's very harsh against slavery and slave owners, calling them evil and soulless. And slave owners are outraged at Garrison. They blame Nat Turner's rebellion on Garrison, which is not necessarily fair because Garrison is a pacifist, right? So in 1832, he also sets up the New England Antislavery Society, which eventually becomes the American Anti-Slavery Society. And what they had hoped to do is maybe try to do what like the English had done, right? End slavery with compensation to owners. Now, in America, that was talked about, but there were those abolitionists saying, why are we compensating people for doing the right thing? Garrison and others still believed that it was the right of each state to legislate its own domestic institution, slavery, but they wanted to convince its citizenry that slavery was a crime before God. And they could even go further, people like Garrison go further, believing that blacks should have the same rights as whites. That's pretty dramatic for the time period. Now, eventually, the movement will split. New Englanders will become very radical. They'll believe American society has been corrupted from top to bottom. Do we hear that today still? Yeah, maybe. And Garrison is a habitual joiner. He embraces every reform of the day. He's anti-slavery, he's into temperance, no alcohol, he's into pacifism, he's into women's rights. He's into everything, and he's a perfectionist. He will not compromise one goal for another. He believed that the Constitution, and get this, was a covenant with death and an agreement with Hell. I don't cuss. Sorry, somebody have to say it for me. Garrison even refused to vote. Now, other members of the Anti-Slavery Society also, they felt that abolition should be the only goal. They said, look, we've got too many irons in the fire. We can't concentrate on so many different issues and get anything done. We have to focus. In 1840, the movement splits. Some, like the Grimke sisters, Sarah and Angelina out of the South, want the movement to embrace feminism. Still others, like I said, are worried that we're going to have too many reforms. Well, this is often when we study history, and history books tend to focus on just the whites and the anti-slavery movements. Well, there were obviously African Americans in the anti-slavery movement. Now, this might shock you, but white leaders of the anti-slavery movement were patronizing toward free blacks, expecting them to literally take a back seat to the movement to whites, saying, look, you guys just need to sit there and be quiet, right? And eventually these free blacks become exasperated because the whites are valuing moral posturing at the expense of actually doing anything. They're just saying they're outraged. They go, no, we need to do something. And of course, free blacks could be the best people to talk about the evils of slavery because they'd been enslaved. People like Sojourner Truth, who spoke of the evils of slavery and the inequities of women. And of course, Harriet Tubman, who we'll talk about here shortly. But probably the best known would have been Frederick Douglass. He had escaped from slavery. Fearful of capture, he flees to Great Britain. He writes a book, does book tours, becomes fairly wealthy, is able to buy his freedom. He'll start a newspaper in Rochester, New York. And he becomes probably the most famous African-American until probably Martin Luther King. Now, Douglas' story of escaping is the best known one. We all hear about it, but it's not unique. Many escaped on their own via the Underground Railroad. And again, if you go back and you read some of this history from the 1940s and 50s, they give whites most of the credit for that, but most of the work is done by freed slaves, especially Harriet Tubman, who, if you saw recently that I think today they're back on fast tracking and putting her on the $20 bill, Jackson will be on the back of the $20 bill. But Harriet Tubman went back to the South 19 times, traveled down to the South 19 times with a death sentence to help free slaves. Well, let's keep in mind something else. Just because you're anti-slavery doesn't mean you're not racist, right? We're going to see racism all throughout the North. They may not like slavery, they may think that's wrong, but that's a far cry from thinking that blacks and whites should have equal rights. So I'll give you an example. I may have mentioned this once before. Prudence Crandall, she ran a private school in Connecticut for girls. And in 1832, she admitted a young black girl to her school. The school closed after 18 months because all the white students were pulled out. And she is forced out of Connecticut by angry crowds for allowing one black girl into her school. In the 1830s, abolitionists took a political turn. And one of the things was to deluge Congress with petitions calling for the abolition of slavery. Well, Congress adopts what we call the Gag Rule, which automatically tables all resolutions. In fact, I think I actually brought up that rule in our last council meeting when somebody said, I want to table something. I said, we really don't want to table it. We want to postpone. Now, the person who fights against this Gag Rule is John Quincy Adams, who, the former president, is now back in the House of Representatives. The Gag Rule was that if anything that you came in with slavery, they were going to automatically put it aside and never talk about it. Why never talk about it? Well, for the Southerners, to talk about it was to admit that they could possibly be wrong, and they weren't going to have that discussion, right? We were not going to have a debate because clearly we're right, you're wrong, we are not discussing it. So the Gag Rule was finally repealed, I believe, in 1843. In 1840, a group of abolitionists formed the Liberty Party with a presidential candidate, James G. Birney. It is the first anti-slavery party in American history, first minor anti-slavery party, the first major party that will take a stand against slavery will be a newly created Republican Party in 1856. Well, what about defense of slavery? Well, of course, Southerners are going to defend it. They're going to use many arguments. One is that they're going to use a biblical argument that, look, if slavery's so wrong, why didn't Jesus come out and say it was wrong? There are slaves in the Bible. They also believe that maybe that slaves had been marked by God as outcasts, that they had the mark of Cain. And of course, this kind of biblical debate will split churches. Hence, you have Southern Baptists and Baptists, Southern Methodists and Methodists. Some also believed that blacks were just inferior, that they were the product of a separate creation. This is what they would call polygenesis, that different races were created at different times. Of course, now that conflicts with the first argument that they'd been marked by God as outcasts, had the mark of Cain. There's a great book on this that talks about the polygenesis theory, and it was about Harvard people in the 1830s and 40s. It's called the Metaphysical Club. You can look that up and see if you want to read it. Another argument they had was, look, slavery was profitable. They were making money. Jefferson wrote that blacks and whites could not live together because there would be a race war, because they said that freed slaves would want revenge over the past injustices. Whites in the North feared job competition. It's going to be this fear of job competition is one of the major reasons why we have this crisis out West, is that Northern states want to have free labor out there and not have to compete with slave labor. John C. Calhoun, the late John C. Calhoun, who we killed off in the last lecture, said that slavery allowed white men to pursue higher things like government and democracy. And this is sort of the interesting one. It's one of those contradictions here that we need to talk about, is that they also believe that slaves are happy. They're incredibly happy. And they would tell Northerners, look, just come down here. We'll prove it to you. And so a Northerner, a journalist or somebody, or some visitor would come up and they would bring in a slave, and they would ask the slave, are you happy here? And of course, what do you think they say? Yes, well, we're so happy here. We're incredibly happy here. Now, of course, Southerners didn't really believe that, because their number one fear in the South was slave revolt. So that is a contradiction, right? You're trying to argue that your slaves are happy, but you're also fearing slave revolt. This is a constant theme in the literature of the time. Southerners will also argue that slavery was better than what they call Northern wage slave labor, that those Northerners who worked in factories, they would argue that they had a paternal instinct toward their slaves and took care of them like they would their own family, except selling out their children for books and wine or things like that. Whereas in the factory, you were just a disposable cog. And of course, racism is going to be used to justify slavery, clearly, because we all know that enslaving people is wrong. So if you're going to enslave somebody, they can't be people. So you make them less than people. Okay, so that's that antebellum period of the South, and there's a lot more to that we could go into, but we're not going to, because survey class, we're moving pretty quickly. But I really want to start for a moment here and hit onto the Kansas and Nebraska crisis, because I promised we'd do this, and we'll get it started. Well, believe it or not, people in the 1850s have the same dreams that you and I do, that we still have today. And it's a common dream that we all have together. And you're probably wondering what that dream is. Well, we all know what it is. It's the idea of a transcontinental railroad. I know I dream about it all the time. But the question was, where are you going to build this transcontinental railroad? Oh, by the way, I was just reading today, as I get distracted, that this is the anniversary in 1916 that they had the first cross-country phone call. That must have been like Star Trek to them. But where are you going to build it, right? Secretary of War at the time in 1853 was Jefferson Davis, and he favored a southern route through the newly Gadsden Purchase, that southern part of Arizona they purchased from Mexico. People in the North wanted a more northern route, but there was a Midwestern spokesman who had other ideas. And that's Stephen Douglas. Remember Stephen Douglas? Stephen Douglas was from Illinois. You'll know him from the Lincoln-Douglas debates. He's very short. He's like 5 foot. You can't get much shorter than 5 feet. And so Douglas said, we could get one from Illinois and take it across. That would be great. But that area where we now know Kansas, Nebraska, and those places are, was unorganized territory. So he had proposed a new territory, a territory of Nebraska. That didn't go anywhere. He did again in 1854, but this time included the entire unorganized portion of Louisiana from where the northern Oklahoma border is all the way up to Canada. Now, to get this territory created, he needs the help of Southerners. And to get the help of Southerners, he has to make concessions to slavery. So one of the things that he does is he introduces popular sovereignty in the bill. Now, if you remember what popular sovereignty was, we ended up having a free soil party at one point. It was this idea that you would allow the voters who moved there to determine whether or not they wanted to have slavery in these new territories. Now, this is a clever ploy by Douglas because according to the Missouri Compromise of 1820, it said that no slavery could be brought into that same portion of the Northwest of the Louisiana Purchase. So all the people that would move there would be free people, not slaveholders. And so they said, look, no dice. We need you to do two things. One, repeal the Missouri Compromise in the bill. And two, create two territories, one Nebraska and one Kansas. And Douglas agrees to this. Why? Who knows? It could have been, the railroad could have been his goal. Maybe, and he's a Democrat, maybe he was hoping to quiet slavery through the issue of popular sovereignty. We don't know. Maybe he was trying to split the Whig Party. But what Douglas doesn't realize is the depth of anti-slavery feelings in parts of the North. And the bill passes in 1854. Northerners are furious because they believed that the Missouri Compromise was a sacred pledge. And if it's not a sacred pledge and it's just going to be thrown aside, so was true of the Fugitive Slave Act from 1850. In fact, in Boston, Anthony Burns, a fugitive slave, somebody running for freedom, many Bostonians tried to rescue him several times. Federal troops have to march him through downtown Boston with crowds lining the streets shouting kidnappers. Buildings are draped in black, church bells are ringing. And he's sent back. They eventually raised money to buy his freedom. But the South sees this as the entire North behaving this way, and it's shaping their public attitudes toward Northerners. Well, the strain of the Kansas-Nebraska Act destroys the Whig Party. Southern Whigs will not support Northern Whigs. Now, Southern Whigs, sometimes known as Cotton Whigs, will just join up with the Democrats. Northern Whigs, sometimes known as Conscience Whigs or anti-slavery Whigs, will move to two new parties. One of them we briefly talked about was the Know Nothings. You remember them? They were a nativist party. You weren't supposed to talk about it. You weren't to vote. You were never to vote for a foreign-born or Catholic candidate. They'll join up there. But most of these Conscience Whigs will join up with independent Democrats and Free Soilers and some leftovers of the Liberty Party. And they will call themselves a variety of names. The Anti-Nebraska Party. And that's just not going to go far. The Fusion Party. The People's Party. But in 1854, they settle on a simple name, harking back to Jefferson's time period. And that, of course, will be the Republican Party. And this is the birth of the Republican Party. The Republican Party being our last successful third party. So we're going to leave it there today, and we'll pick up there next time dealing with bleeding Kansas, Civil War in Kansas, Northern Kansas, anti-slavery, Southern Kansas, pro-slavery, armed to the teeth, and fighting a civil war 4 years before the Civil War. So thanks for coming, and then we will see you next time.